Robert the Bruce and Macbeth are probably the two most famous Scottish kings. They were two very different Scottish kings, but both their reigns were turning points in Scottish history. So when the stage plays and Hollywood films are put aside, how do they compare? I think you might be surprised. If you're interested in the people, places and events in Scottish history, then click the subscribe button at the bottom right of the screen. In the meantime, let me tell you two stories. The mound behind me is Moot Hill, the Hill of Parliament. It's where medieval Scottish kings were inaugurated. Now they say that the reason that the hill exists is that the Mortimers of Scotland had to swear an oath to the king on their own land. So they would bring some of their land here to Scone and place it on what over time would become the Hill of Parliaments, where Scottish kings would be seated on the stone of destiny. Now this is a replica. The real one's on display in Edinburgh Castle. Or is it? That's a question for another day. But the two most famous men to have sat here were of course Macbeth and Robert the Bruce. One eulogised in a book by John Barbour, the other demonised in a play by William Shakespeare. So what's the truth behind their title to the throne, their popularity at the time, their piety, the peace and security of the kingdom, their route to the throne, and has there been a murder? In order to find out, we're going to have to navigate a maze of propaganda. Let's start with our claim to the throne. Shakespeare famously tells us that Macbeth is a usurper. But the truth's more complicated than that. You see, in Macbeth's day, the King of Scots wasn't necessarily the eldest son of the previous king. The new king was chosen by a process called tanistry, which effectively meant that an electoral college of important people chose the best candidate from the wider royal family. Now, Macbeth's dad, Finlay, had married a woman firmly connected to the King of Scots at the time. There's even a suggestion that Doda, Macbeth's mother, was the daughter of Malcolm II. But certainly, when the time was right and he grew to maturity, it wouldn't have been unreasonable for Macbeth to expect to be king himself. When Macbeth got married, the hard-nosed schemer so many people know as Lady Macbeth was actually called Gruach. She was the granddaughter of the previous king, and the man that Malcolm II had killed to gain himself the throne. That made Macbeth's claim that bit more certain. What about Robert the Bruce? By his time, tanistry had been replaced by primogeniture, so that the eldest son became king. But Alexander III had died without surviving issue. Now, the Bruce family, supremely ambitious Normans whose power base had been in the north of England, were desperate to put their man on the Scottish throne. In fact, Bruce's granddad nearly started a civil war to gain the crown. And that's why the Guardians of Scotland turned to Edward Longshanks. Yes, him. To adjudicate who should be king. Grandad Robert the Bruce or John Balliol. Now, for all Edward's evil deeds, there's no reason to believe that his decision to choose John Balliol was anything other than following the accepted legal system at the time. Meaning that the Bruce family weren't the rightful kings. Was that 1-0 to Macbeth? Maybe with Robert the Bruce missing a penalty. So how did Robert the Bruce come to be king? Well, I was discussing this recently with Dr. Fiona Watson in Braco Coffee Shop. She is the distinguished academic and delightful raconteur that I met with for one of my monthly conversations with experts. I've covered both Macbeth and Robert the Bruce in some of my previous videos. More importantly, Fiona has written books about both. Now, if you want to see the hour-and-a-half long conversation with Fiona in full, then you can join up as a Patreon member by clicking the white tab and become a Whisky member. She was absolutely brilliant. But here's just a snippet of one of the things that we discussed. Edward I of England was growing old and near to death. Now, when he died, there'd be a realignment of the political tables of these islands. So Robert the Bruce arranged a meeting in Dumfries Abbey with John Cummin, the man who was most likely to gain the Scottish throne. And he murdered them. Is this a dagger I see before me? Yes, it bloody well is. You just stabbed your main rival with it on holy ground, no less. And then you lured them under the pretext of a meeting to smooth over the waters in the first place. Then you headed to Scone to have yourself crowned king. If William Shakespeare ever finds out about this, it'll be all over the papers. You'll be left without a name. Fortunately, Bruce had the much more friendly biographer of John Barbour. Actually, almost 300 years before. Duncan II of Scotland, after a couple of previous defeats in battle in Northumbria against the English and then in the north against the Orkney Jarl, takes his army to invade Moray, whose Mortimer, or sub-king, is a guy called Macbeth. Now, Macbeth kills Duncan in battle, or as you might say in court, in self-defence. But while his troops prevailed in battle, he had the worst PR team in history. What happened to Macbeth today? Ah, well, he was invaded by Duncan, but good news is that he defeated and killed Duncan and was selected under the rules of Tanistry to be the next King of Scots. Ah, right, so at the instigation of dark occult forces and inspired by witchcraft, he offered hospitality to Duncan and then murdered him in his bed, thus usurping the throne. Got it? No, sorry mate, you're not listening. Duncan attacked the English and lost. Then he attacked Torrhen, spelled Thorfinn the Mighty, and lost. Then he attacked Macbeth and got killed. And frankly, people were just so delighted to appoint Macbeth as king just for a bit of respite. Ah, sorry, I misheard. So, Macbeth also ordered the murder of his best friend Banquo and his little boy. No, Banquo's no real. Ah, but he did have Macduff's family murdered, right? Now, we're going to talk about the differences in their reigns, but first, let me point out a similarity. Where Bruce and Macbeth were similar was that both of them were exiled and probably escaped to Ireland, but for two very different reasons. When Macbeth was a boy, his two uncles murdered his dad and took control of Moray. Macbeth had to flee for safety, but several years later, when he'd grown to maturity, he returned. At just about the same time his murdering uncle was burned to death in a house with his entourage, and Macbeth was reinstated in his family line as King of Moray. How convenient! Robert the Bruce also had a period of exile across the seas to the west. When he declared himself king, there were a lot of folk that weren't entirely keen on the idea, and after losing 3 successful battles, he fled across the sea before he came back and gradually took back control of the kingdom. So, how long do you think Macbeth reigned as King of Scots? How long? Whatever number you've got in your head right now, tell me in the comment section below. Robert the Bruce reigned for 22 years. Macbeth for 17. Aha! I bet when you read Shakespeare at school, you thought it was about 6 months, didn't you? No. 17 years of relative peace, prosperity and plenty. Whereas Robert the Bruce, well, initially he had to fight off those loyal to Edward I. In the process, Edward had one of the Bruce brothers hung, drawn and quartered, and the women close to him hung in cages. On his first failed attempt to return from exile and the reinvasion of the mainland, Bruce also lost another 2 brothers. When he eventually did regain a foothold in his southwestern hinterland, he then proceeded to parts of the Highlands and Moray to lay waste to that area because of their support for the Cummins. Remember? Gradually, by this hership, he subdued the nation to his will. before winning an absolutely stunning victory at Bannockburn, a battle prompted by his ultimatum that those with lands in England had to submit to him. He never ever really resolved that problem, which is what actually started the Second War of Independence shortly after Robert the Bruce died. I've got videos on that. Whilst Robert the Bruce had loads of conflict internally and externally, Macbeth's reign was relatively uneventful. Now, 5 years into his reign, previous King Duncan's dad did try to lead a force against him, but apart from that... But Macbeth's not out of the Burnham woods yet. All I'm saying is that internal conflict seems to have been minimal during his reign. So much so that Macbeth, you know, the murdering, occult dealing usurper, well, his kingdom was so tranquil and stable that he was able to leave the country for months and go off on pilgrimage to see the Pope in Rome. The only Scottish monarch to do that. That's not the picture that's normally painted of Macbeth, is it? Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that Macbeth didn't carry other men's blood in his hands. I'm just saying that Robert the Bruce had to carry that blood in a bucket. Now, to be fair to Bruce, later kings than Macbeth had an alternative to pilgrimage. They could go on crusade. And Bruce wanted to do that. It's just that he was always fighting external, internal battles. Oh, and he was excommunicated, so the nearest he actually got to crusade was when he died, and they took his heart and threw it at some Muslims. On Bruce's positive tally, he died in his bed. Whereas Macbeth, having lost a battle here at Dunsinane Hillfort in 1054, may have managed to hold on for another 3 years. That's right, he wasn't killed either here or by Macduff. But eventually, when Duncan's son invaded with an English army, he was killed 70 miles north of here at Lumphanan. Look, they were both medieval kings, but the times they lived in were different from each other. Scotland was different. England was different. The rules of succession that they played by were different. But when you look at the two of them, if anyone deserves the title of overambitious murdering usurper, I tell you what, why don't you decide? If you want to understand how things changed between the time of Macbeth and Bruce, then I've got a really popular video called The Forgotten Kings of Scotland. It'll be coming up on screen now. In the meantime, Hammy and Dawkins can be a lamb ally. Cheerio and drast.
How much do you want of this?